excited to, we are excited to bring you this webinar. This is the third in a series of webinars that we have done this month in February, and this one is all about restraint and seclusion. I am Tina Andrews. I'm a project coordinator with the Parent Information Center of Delaware. We are the parent training and information program in Delaware, and we support youth advocates, families of children with disabilities, and professionals who serve them. We do this in a number of ways, including one-on-one consultations, webinars, trainings, and systems advocacy. We have many online resources at our website at pickofdel.org. We also have a weekly e-news letter that goes out every Thursday. And we have newsletters centered around early childhood, transition age students, teens, and in Spanish. So please check out our website for that information. And I'm excited to welcome Stephanie from the Disabilities Law Program, who has been partnered with us these last 2 months to bring you this great information. Stephanie, can you tell us about the Disabilities Law Program?
Sure. So as Tina said, I'm Stephanie. I'm a staff attorney with the Disabilities Law Program at the Community Legal Aid Society. We serve as the protection and advocacy system for the state of Delaware. And we provide free civil legal services to vulnerable and underserved Delawareans, including individuals with disabilities. We engage in individual and systemic advocacy, so individual on a case-by-case basis, and systemic when there's an issue affecting a large group of individuals. We also provide information, referrals, and technical assistance. In particular for this information that's being provided today, one of the special things that the Disabilities Law Program is able to do as the protection and advocacy system for the state of Delaware is when we get reports of alleged abuse or neglect, we can conduct an independent investigation into that. And that also includes instances of restraint and seclusion in schools.
So today, as the end session in our discipline series, we're going to talk about restraint and seclusion. Our previous 2 sessions talked about discipline, special education, and IDEA, and also what is a manifestation determination review. Both of those are available on our YouTube page as well as in our video portal on our website, and I would highly encourage you to watch those if you are interested in those topics. So today we're going to talk about seclusion and the 3 types of restraint. Hopefully you will leave here understanding when and how physical restraint may be imposed. Also, we're going to talk about the consequences of restraint and seclusion, and we're going to talk about how to advocate around restraint and seclusion in the school and other environments.
And one caution that I do want to make is that some of the things that we're going to be talking about today might be some of the images and pictures, videos might be a little disturbing. So if you need to get up and leave the room or leave the presentation for whatever reason, please feel free to do so. And I will try to make note before, at the slide beforehand, so you can just be aware of that. And so I just want to briefly kind of go through the history of restraint and seclusion in schools. It's the next slides that are coming. There's a lot of information on them that I'm not going to go through each bullet point, but it's a matter of just kind of understanding where we started and where we are now. So even in 1999, the main focus was on the use of restraint and seclusion, not in schools and not in those types of settings, but in psychiatric facilities. And it wasn't until 2007, 2008, where the US Government Accountability Office, or the GAO, began to receive reports and look into the use of restraint and seclusion in those settings. So there in April 2008, there was the report of death, abuse, and deceptive marketing at residential programs. Following that, there were at least two reports that were done, one from NDRN, which is the National Disability Rights Network, and the other one is COPA, which is the Council of Parents, Parents and Attorney Advocates. And both of those reports dealt specifically with the use of restraint and seclusion in schools and the consequences of those practices. And this is a chart from the COPA report. It's really interesting to note that the majority of restraints, out of 185 of those restraints that COPA looked at, 68% of them were students with autism. And it's interesting to note that, because even in the data today that we'll briefly look at, it's the same thing. It's students with autism, or who are on the autism spectrum, tend to be the ones who are being restrained the most often. So following following the reports from NDRN and COPA, there were kind of a interest ignited in looking at the use of restraint and seclusion in schools. So there was a hearing that was held in 2009, which was accompanied by a GAO report specifically looking at death and abuse from the use of restraint and seclusion at public and private schools. In July of 2009, the Secretary of Education at the time, Arne Duncan, sent a letter encouraging states to look at what policies, procedures, guidelines, and everything that they had that was specifically targeted at the use of restraint and seclusion in schools. And then also at that time, the Civil Rights Data Collection said that they were going to, beginning in the 2009-2010 school year, start capturing data on the use of restraint and seclusion. So what was Delaware doing in 2009? So in 2009, Delaware had absolutely no laws, regulations specific to restraint or seclusion in schools. A lot of the laws around restraint and seclusion were specific to nursing homes, psychiatric facilities, and those types of settings. There's really nothing in there about restraint seclusion in schools. The only thing that was in there was in its 14 Del Ad in the regulations, which dealt specifically with special programs and unique educational alternatives. And it talked about for students with autism who are in those special autism programs, like the Delaware Autism Program and any others, all it said was that emergency intervention procedures and behavior management procedures would be reviewed by this human rights committee, and the school would have to receive informed parental consent for those management behaviors. So nothing specific about restraint and seclusion, just if there was some behavior management being used, the school would have to get informed consent for that. And that's all that there was at the time. So 2010, there was another report about restraint and seclusion in schools. And then in May of 2012, the U.S. Department of Education issued guidance, and it's like a 55, 60-page document all about the use of restraint and seclusion in public schools. It has 15 best practice or principles to use. And I highlighted just some of the quotes from that I think are really important to note. And so those are listed here. And I think one of the biggest things is that last one: there continues to be no evidence that using restraint or seclusion is effective in reducing the occurrence of problem behaviors. So after this, Delaware finally catches on, right? So prior to that report, 2012, nothing about restraint and seclusion in schools. In June of 2013, Senate Bill 100 of the 147th General Assembly was signed into law. And what that does is it provides limitations on the use of restraint and seclusion. It also requires the Department of Education to actually develop regulations for this statute. And that actually came the following year in August. And that is what we are going to talk about now. So these regulations are titled the Limitations on Use of Seclusion and Restraint, and it's found in Title 14 of the Delaware Code, which is all about education. And so it covers when restraint and seclusion can be used, when it's prohibited, different training requirements, documentation, reporting, parental notifications, and waiver procedures. So we're going to take these kind of piece by piece to talk through. So seclusion in Delaware Code, so there's no federal definition for schools in terms of what seclusion is, what restraint is. There are definitions in like the medical context. There's also a specific definition that the civil rights data collection uses. For us, we use the Delaware definitions that are found in the regulations, and it defines seclusion as the involuntary confinement of a student alone in a room, enclosure, or space that is either locked, or if it's unlocked, the student is unable to leave. And this does not include timeout, where a staff member is accessible or is there to help the student as needed. The use of seclusion is prohibited in Delaware unless the Secretary of the Delaware Department of Education authorizes a waiver. And we're going to talk about kind of what those waiver requirements are. So it has to be made in writing to the Department of Education, and it's generally the school district that will make that request. It has to talk about the conditions of where the seclusion is going to happen, any safeguards, so parental notification, how the student will be observed or looked at while the seclusion is happening, the waiver authorization and release of information signed by the parent. So before the waiver process can't be done unilaterally. It has to have the consent of the parent to allow the school to use seclusion. And it's good for 1 year. After that 1 year, they have to go through the whole process again. And then there's a timeline for when, after the request is made, how long it should take to actually be able to get the waiver approved. So these are some examples of seclusion rooms. These are not in Delaware in particular. These are seclusion rooms in other states, but I wanted to include them just so you can get an idea of what it would look like, right? What it entails. And so as you can see, it's a room completely off on its own. It has the door. They tend to be padded to prevent students from injuring themselves by hitting their head on the wall or some other reason. Generally in the classroom, so that the teacher can at least continue to look and see where that student is. Should have lights. Sometimes there have been instances where students have been in seclusion rooms and have been completely in the dark. But this is generally what they look like. The only other thing that I want to say on that is that in the definition, it says that it doesn't necessarily have to be like a locked or unlocked room. So it could be a room that doesn't even have a door on it, but as long as there is somebody there blocking the door so that that student cannot leave, and that student is alone otherwise, that could be considered seclusion. So now we're going to talk about the different types of restraint. So there are 3 types. There's chemical restraint, mechanical restraint, and physical restraint. Chemical restraint is completely prohibited in Delaware public schools, private programs, and alternative programs. And it's the use of medication to control the behavior of the student, restrict their movement, and it's completely prohibited. So schools are not allowed to give a student some drug, whether by mouth or by IV or syringe or something, to calm them down or restrict their movement in some way. Mechanical restraint is using an object to restrict the movement of a student or to prevent them from having access to a part of their body. And that device can't easily be removed. This is another one of the strategies or techniques that has to have a waiver to be used in Delaware schools. So if a waiver has not been authorized for the use of mechanical restraint, it can't be used in Delaware public schools, private programs, and other things. So there are some things that mechanical restraint does not include. So it does not include adaptive devices, vehicle safety restraints. So if a student receives special transportation in a van and they have the seat belt, that's not going to be considered a mechanical restraint. It's for safety. And So the using like another object to prevent some kind of self injury. So if using mittens to prevent the student from, picking at their fingers, for instance. So these are some examples of mechanical restraint. In the bottom left picture is a student who has what look to be handcuffs, and he's restricted from moving, essentially, at least moving his arms. And then the upper right picture is a picture of a chair that has like lap belts almost, and for your feet, a way to restrict your feet and keep them in place. These are both considered mechanical restraints because it's a device, it's an object that's being used to restrict the movement of a student's body in some way. So physical restraint is probably the type of restraint that we see more often, that we hear about more often. And what it is in Delaware definition is a restriction that is imposed by a person that immobilizes or reduces the ability of a student to freely move arms, legs, body, or head. So instead of using a device, it's a person using their own body to restrict the movement of a student. It does not include physical contact that's going to help a student respond or complete a task as needed to administer a health-related service, or to physically escort a student when the student does not resist or the student's resistance is minimal. So that would be like, a teacher who has the hand on the back of a student's walking, teacher just has their hand on their back, not necessarily forcing the student to move. Student is moving freely on their own, but that, just hand on the back, and that's okay. It's where the student is unable to move in some way, not their whole body, but even just moving an arm. If they can't move their arm, it's considered a physical restraint.
And just a warning, there are some pictures coming up of students being physically restrained. So if you are sensitive to that, you can, join us in a few minutes, or just be aware.
So these are three different examples of physical restraint. In the bottom left picture, this is actually a still from the video of Cornelius Frederick, who unfortunately passed away while being restrained. And as you can see, there are several staff members who are physically holding him down and restricting his ability to move. In the top middle picture is a student who is being carried down the hall by two teachers, one at his legs and the other one up by his head. And as they're walking down the hallway, literally carrying him there. This would be considered a physical restraint because they're restricting his ability to move freely on his own. And then the bottom right picture is similar in that it's a staff member who is on top of that student, restricting his ability to move freely. And in all three of these cases, they're not appropriate uses of physical restraint. They don't follow, the what's required for physical restraint and how they're being used, right? Physical restraint should not result in the death or injury of the individual being restrained. So Delaware has very specific requirements for when physical restraint can be used. And it's really only in rare circumstances. So it can only be used if there's a significant and imminent risk of bodily harm to self or others. And that's really important, that it's a significant and imminent risk. It can't be something like just a threat that's being made, right? Like if a student is across the room and says, "I'm going to punch you in the face," the teacher can't go over there and physically restrain him. That's not an imminent risk. Student's so far away, and it might not be a significant risk either. The restraint cannot interfere with that student's ability to breathe or communicate in their primary language or mode of communication. So if it is a student whose primary language is American Sign Language, any kind of restraint that prevents that student from using their hands to communicate, that's an invalid restraint, that it can't be used in that way. Same thing if a student has a communication device to like a assistive technology to help them communicate. If that physical restraint prevents that student from being able to use that device to communicate, right? That's an issue. That's a restraint that shouldn't have been done in that way. The restraint cannot interfere with that student's ability to breathe. And it can't place weight or pressure on head, throat, or neck. So in that last picture that we saw, you could see the staff member having his hand on the back of that student's neck. And so that's a bad restraint. And it can't exacerbate a medical or physical condition of the student. So if that student has asthma, and the physical restraint in some way exacerbates that, that the physical restraint can't be used at that point. And there are additional restrictions on physical restraint. Before physical restraint can be used, other interventions have to have been tried before. So you can't jump right to physical restraint. The staff member has to try other measures first. So redirection, maybe taking the student outside, doing something like that. That's not the case though, where there's like a emergency circumstance, such as like a student fight. A physical restraint can be used in that point, but the incident has to be clearly unavoidable, right? Like there's no other option but to use physical restraint. And it only happens in very, very rare circumstances. If it's a student with an IEP, it can't violate what's in their IEP or behavior plan. And you can only use the amount of force necessary. So you can't go, so if it's a kindergarten student who's being restrained, right, the amount of force that's necessary for that student is going to be it might be completely different than the amount of force that you would need to restrain a high school student, for instance. And the restraint has to end if there's a medical condition that puts the student at risk, or once the student's behavior is no longer causing an imminent risk of bodily harm to either themselves or others. And so this just kind of lists the level of force that may be used for teachers, has to be reasonable and moderate, consistent with the welfare of the child, so in their best interest, and it cannot cause, and is not likely to cause, physical injury, mental distress, a substantial risk of physical injury or death. And a teacher cannot throw, kick, burn, cut, strike with a closed fist, interfere with breathing, use or threaten to use a deadly weapon, or deprive the student of sustenance, such as food or water or medication. So if they are being physically restrained and they require medication at regular intervals, even if that student is restrained, right, the staff still has to provide them with their necessary medical medications or a food if they're diabetic. Tina, do you want to take the next couple of slides?
Sure. So let's have a discussion, because this is not clear all the time, and Stephanie will help us in terms of what the law says. So in talking about restraint, we have an example here of a 15-year-old student that threatens to punch her peer. She is within 1 foot of the student with her arm raised towards that student. So what do you think? Put in the chat, is the use of a physical restraint warranted? And that would be a physical restraint by the teacher, an administrator, an adult. So we have yes, no, which is exactly what I expect, because these are difficult situations.
Yeah, and to that, right, there's the decision of whether a restraint was warranted, right, is going to be on a case-by-case basis, right? If that same scenario happened, but maybe one student was, even if they're the same age, if one student was significantly larger in stature than the other student, you might have two different outcomes. Same thing if it's two friends, maybe, right? Like if the teacher overhears this conversation happening and it's really just two friends playing, that, you know, is that warranted? Probably not. And in most instances, the physical restraint, right, is not warranted. And exactly as Carol pointed out, what other interventions have been tried already, right? This is not significant and imminent risk. It might be imminent because that, you know, if that student's arm is raised and they're a foot away, right, they're real close. But I don't know that it would be a significant risk. And there weren't other interventions that had been tried in the past or that had been tried before, you know, automatically jumping to physical restraint. That physical restraint is it should be the last resort after everything has been tried, unless in the very, very rare and unavoidable circumstance of an emergency.
Well, and in this case too, you know, asking the other student to leave the room, de-escalating the situation, like you were saying, other things could be tried depending on the student, the situation, what has happened previously. Here's another conversation. So you have a large 5-year-old who runs at full speed toward a teacher with her head down and rams her in the stomach. She then attempts to repeatedly punch the teacher in the stomach. Is the use of a physical restraint warranted? What do we think? Yes. We have one yes. It depends. Is it allowed in the IEP or the behavior intervention plan?
Well, and to that, right, it depends on whether the student is a student with a disability, right? Because if that student is not a student with a disability, then there might not be an IEP or behavior intervention plan, behavior support plan that would be, that would be able to inform the situation, because these regulations limiting the use of restraint and seclusion, they're for every student, right? Not just for students with disabilities. So it applies to all students. There's just special protections for students with disabilities. So it very well could be that that particular student has an IEP or behavior intervention plan that has outlined very specific procedures for a situation like this. And that teacher would need to make sure that they are following that procedure if in fact there is one. There also could be a safety plan or a crisis plan that would have similar procedures in place. And then so questions to consider, right? Will there be bodily injury that involves risk of death, disfigurement, loss or impairment of the body, of a organ, right? Mental faculty. So if in the case of the even though that 5-year-old might be larger, is there a risk for a significant risk of physical injury, right? What level of injury could that student cause? And if
And
it's
really,
not
it depends. Yeah, because we don't know, maybe the teacher is pregnant, or maybe the teacher has an injury or a disability. So like, we said previously, it's really dependent on the situation. And, whether there's an IEP and a behavior intervention plan in place, whether there were previous interventions with this student, before this happened.
So now we're gonna talk through some of the consequences of restraint seclusion. The next three, I want to say 3 slides. The next 2 have some news headlines showing some of the effects, the devastating effects of restraint and seclusion on students. And then the 3rd slide is going to be a video that probably about 5 minutes that I'd like to play. So if it's something that you think might be troubling for you to watch or look at, please feel free to step away. So the picture from before of the staff member holding the student by the back of the neck, that is the top headline. The Georgia teen loses leg after teacher's body slam. That's that student. That is what happened to that student after being restrained. He actually lost his leg. In another instance, after secluding a student, the school aide died by suicide. right? It's not just the students who are impacted by the use of restraint and seclusion. It's also staff members. It's also parents. The next one, 7-year-old dies following a restraint at a day program. There was, and actually in that instance, she was restrained because she was giddy and blowing bubbles in her milk and wouldn't stop. The next one, specifically the story highlights, there was a student who hung himself in the seclusion room with a cord that the teacher gave him to keep his pants up. Confined to a storage closet, and pulls her hair out. And then other consequences are bruises, a lot of bruises from mechanical restraints, the objects or devices used to effectuate the restraint. But they can also be caused by the physical restraints and seclusions as well. And so it's the use of restraint seclusion when it causes these physical injuries, it really results in that lack of trust between the parent and the school, because the school is in loco parentis, right, in place of the parent. So when you're right, when the student is there at the school, that school is acting as the parent for that student. They're supposed to take care of them. And when kids come home with bruises all over their bodies from being restrained, it's very hard for many parents to continue to trust the school with the care of their student. And so this video, I want to start it at 9 minutes and 15 seconds, if we can do that, if it'll play. You can start it a little bit after.
At my old school, from 2nd to 7th grade, I was like an awesome student. I had great grades. I had perfect attendance awards from 2nd grade to 7th grade for every 9 weeks. I mean, I excelled in history because that is part of my Asperger's syndrome. I have a photographic memory. That's also a reason why I can't forget what happened to me in school. When I was 13, my family moved 7 miles away to a new school district. I corrected a teacher who gave out the wrong information about Ohio history. After I corrected him, he called me the R word and gave me 2 Saturday schools. I wrote to my state senator, and he actually wrote me and my teacher and informed me that I was right and told my teacher I was right. When that letter got to the teacher that day, he gave me 2 more Saturday schools. My 9th grade history teacher asked me and 3 other general ed special needs students to stand up in class. She then belittled us by saying, "I do not need nor want them in my class." That discussion came up because the teacher was openly discussing the No Child Left Behind Act in our classroom and asked our class if it was fair that we were allowed in class with them, but didn't have to test as well as them on the proficiency test to move ahead. Older students held me down and smeared ketchup and mashed potatoes in my hair and stuff, in my face, and they said not to mess with the school because our schools in Royal, Ohio are the bread and butter of the community. At my IEP meeting, like a month later after that incident, I had tested well enough to be put into an advanced English class my freshman year. But the teacher of that class stated at my IEP meeting that my disability was holding back the other students. My mom asked for an example and she could not give any. I was being placed in ISS almost every school day. I spent 35 consecutive days in a what used to be a storage room under the weight room in the basement of my school. It was concrete and there's 2 metal doors that were padlocked from the outside. There was no windows and no heat. And the only person who had a key to that padlock was the principal. You could scream in there, no one would hear you. Most students did not even know I was present at school that day. They'd see me at the end of the day getting on the bus and they'd be like, "Where was you all day?" In the basement. I remember I was in study skills one time and I heard my friend in there and he wasn't allowed out and he was saying, "I need to use the bathroom, I need to use the bathroom." And he defecated and urinated on himself. And he never came back to school after that. After I spent 35 days in there, ODE ordered no more ISS for me at the 3rd due process hearing in January of 2004. 1 week later, my vice principal came to my science class where I was taking a test and asked me to join him in the hallway, so I did. And I walked out there. He told me I needed to report to the ISS room, seclusion room. And I calmly reminded him that I was supposed to call my mom or attorney if this happened again. And I turned to walk away from him to go back to class because that's what I was told to do. They told me not to engage or argue in any way. But he slammed me up against the wall, arm barred me across the throat and lifted up so I couldn't breathe, and then whispered, "How am I supposed to talk to you nice and slow so you can understand?" At that moment, I truly thought that I was going to die, so I asked God to make it fast. But he let go, and then they put me in the back of a van with my truant officer and school secretary. They took me into the superintendent and special needs director's office. And the superintendent said, "I feel sorry for you because you have no future." And then there was a knock on the door. And then I guess I blacked out because I was traumatized because I don't remember the rest of the day. But apparently that knock at the door was my stepdad because another student had alerted them that they dragged me into the elementary. And that was my last day of school. And later that night, I did try and take my own life. And that's when I was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. And after that incident, from January 2004, for 6 months, I did not even step a foot outside my house. I did not socialize, and my skin never, ever saw sunlight. That was my school experience. People always are like, "Why didn't your mom just pull you out?" And why should she have? There's a law that says that I'm allowed to be there. She was fighting for my rights. When I went to that school, they took away all of my confidence that my mom took years to instill in me. My sister was the valedictorian of her graduating class and has a PhD now from Ohio State University, and she had ADD. She was fortunate that she never had to go to that school, and I wish that I could be like everybody else in my family. I can't.
You can stop it there. So there, in this particular film, there's 4 or 5 different stories. The link to the whole video was down at the bottom of that slide. If you would like to watch the whole thing, it's probably about 35 or 40 minutes for the whole thing, and it's really gives kind of that. Like the understanding for what seclusion and restraint can do to a student. So with all of that, right, why do we use restraints or seclusion? And there have been several rationales or reasons given for why we use them. Schools, teachers say, well, it keeps the student safe. It's therapeutic. Teachers need it because they need to be able to use all of their tools. And it's educational because it teaches students proper behavior, because if I can discipline them for acting out in a way that I don't think is the right way to act, then I can, punish them, and they can then learn proper behavior. But they're not good reasons, right? Especially given the devastating effects of seclusion and restraint. It doesn't keep students safe. There have been instances where students have died because of restraints. They're physically injured, as we just saw, emotionally traumatized. And a lot of the reasons why students are restrained is for compliance rather than for some safety reason. And remember, in Delaware, in order to use that physical restraint, other than needing to try all of these other interventions beforehand, it requires a significant and imminent risk to bodily harm. Compliance is likely not going to meet that level to require some type of physical restraint. There's also no therapeutic benefit to this, and there have actually been studies that have shown this. And generally, after restraints and seclusions happen, behaviors escalate. They don't decrease. And as we had kind of talked about before, it sets up the cycle of fear and distrust between the parent, the school, and the student. And schools should be safe and supportive environments for students. It's a place for them to learn. It shouldn't be a place for them to, be traumatized in some way. So we've kind of talked a lot about what it is, what it looks like in Delaware. So this is actually data from Delaware. And remember, Delaware is a very small state, right? I think our total student enrollment is 20 or 30,000, I think. So there's data here from the CRDC, the Civil Rights Data Collection, and then there's data from the annual report that's required for the Department of Education to put out every year on their use of physical restraint. The most recent civil rights data collection is from the school year 2017-18. That shows that there were 599 total students who were restrained. It doesn't give the total number of restraints. It just gives the number of students. Over 51% were students of color, were Black students. 79% were students with disabilities, and over 80% were male students. In terms of seclusion, and remember, seclusion requires waiver and parental consent. In 2017-18 school year, there were 8 total students who were secluded. 4 of the students were Black, 5 were students with disabilities. And then in terms of the annual report in Delaware, the most recent report that came out was from the 2020-2021 school year, and that was released in December. I didn't want to use those numbers because with COVID and everything, they're likely not going to give you the full picture of what's going on. So I wanted to use the data from the last full school year in person that we've had before COVID. And that shows 849 total students were restrained in almost 3,000 physical restraints, which means there are students who are being restrained on multiple occasions. It's not just one student being restrained one time, it's multiple students being restrained over and over and over again. And the other issue is there are a lot of instances where these physical restraints are not actually reported for one reason or another, whether the staff member thinks that it didn't qualify as a restraint, so they're not going to do it, or they just never did it. And the annual report that Delaware puts out actually will explain how, that there is underreporting, and they'll look at discipline logs to see whether something looks like it was a restraint that happened that just wasn't recorded, and they'll ask them to go back in there and fix it. And of these numbers, 52% are Black students, 78% students with disabilities. And if you look at the numbers, 50% of the students with disabilities that are being physically restrained are students with autism, and students, or the educational classification of autism and emotional disturbance. 81% are male, and I think the most concerning figure is that the majority of students who are being restrained are between the ages of 6 and 11. I do see the questions there. And Carol, I wasn't ignoring that because that's coming up very shortly. And I know that we are short on time, so I won't go into too much detail on these. But I wanted to include all the data in here for when the presentation is provided to you. So parents must be notified no later than 24 hours after the incident, and has to be done either by phone, email, voicemail, in person, however they want to attempt to do it, and there has to be documentation. The documentation has to include a whole list of things, including how the restraint happened, the information of the student, any changes to the IEP, policy or procedure, or if there's additional staff training. And this report is given to the parent no later than on the day that it is filed with the Department of Education. And that report has to be filed within 72 hours of the restraint. So training, there is mandatory training on at least physical restraint, not necessarily on seclusion, but on the use of physical restraint. They are required to go through annual training, and it's not all staff members are trained. There will be staff members who are not trained, but the majority of school staff should be trained. And it is training on crisis prevention, intervention techniques, positive behavioral intervention strategies and support. And they have to be consistent with nationally recognized training programs. So, and Brian, to your question, if a school resource officer or law enforcement representative is called to the school, administers a restraint, does the school have to report it as a restraint? If it is happening on school grounds, and generally although the school resource officer is not necessarily considered a member of the school staff, there are requirements. Let me pull this up too, just so I can, there's specific information concerning school resource officers. Actually, in this regulation, that talks about their training, and how they like what their duties and responsibilities are. There's no requirement that if the SRO is the one that does it, that it needs to be reported. But there, you know, if the restraint is happening on school grounds, there should be some type of report anyway, because if they're having to call law enforcement for some reason, that it has to be documented, and there's going to be documentation of the call and of what happens after the law enforcement was called. So personnel that is not trained may still use reasonable and necessary force to, break up a fight if needed, obtain possession of a weapon, and self-defense or defense of others. And remember, it has to be reasonable and necessary. And they can also use incidental or minor physical contact to maintain order and control. So that would be like a hand on the back, of a student who might be being loud in class, and hand on the back and say, hey, let's calm it down a little bit. That's totally okay. But that means personnel who are not trained may still physically restrain a student in those very rare circumstances. Remember, it has to be a last resort. It has to be a rare occurrence, even for trained personnel. And then for staff who are not trained, it should be even more rare, right? That should be like way last resort. So what can you do as parent, as advocate? Don't agree to the inclusion of something in the IEP behavior intervention plan, crisis plan, that includes physical restraint, right? You don't, as a member of the IEP team, as a parent, as a member of the IEP team, you don't have to agree to include something like that in there. You can ask the school about other things that they're doing to address the behavior, including MTSS, right? Multi-tiered systems of support, trauma-informed practices. And remember, for a waiver for mechanical restraint or seclusion has to have parental informed consent. You don't have to agree to that. You can say, no, I would prefer my child not be mechanically restrained or secluded. You can ask, your child during the day, or ask your child how their day went, whether they were in a room alone, whether they felt uncomfortable, whether they were grabbed by staff in any way. You can ask about any unexplained injuries. If your student comes home and there's bruises on their arm or wrist, right? What happened? And you can ask for behavior and incident reports from the school, and they can provide those to you. And you can do that on a daily basis, right? Ask your student's teacher, hey, what happened today? Were there any behaviors? And if there were, can you, send me information about what happened?
So hopefully we have met our learning objectives here, which were to define seclusion and the 3 types of restraint, understand when and how physical restraint may be imposed, explain the consequences of restraint and seclusion, and learn how to advocate around restraint and seclusion. And there will be a survey sent out to you after this presentation. Please fill that out. It helps us when planning future webinars, and gives us an idea of whether this was useful for you, whether you will be able to use this information. That should be coming to you after this presentation. If you have any personal questions or concerns, please feel free to give us a call. You can get our contact information through our websites. Also, please feel free to ask for this presentation. I can send you a copy of the presentation that will have this information on there too. I know that Stephanie always says, presentation, the information that was provided is general information. It is not legal advice. Every situation is different. So if you do have a specific situation, please feel free to contact us. And thank you so much to everybody. We appreciate you spending time with us. And if you have any questions, we are certainly open to exploring them with you about this topic and others. We will have webinars in the future. Please check out our events page and also our e-news that goes out every Thursday for upcoming topics. Thank you and have a great day.